1944. The beaches of Normandy were supposed to be the end of the war, the moment when Allied strength finally crushed the fortress of Nazi Europe. But in the weeks before D-Day, deep in the English countryside, one man stared at a pile of scrap metal and rusting farm tractors and saw something no one else could: salvation. His name was Donald Bailey, a quiet British engineer who didn't wear medals, didn't carry a gun, and didn't command troops. But he was about to change the course of history with a machine so strange, so improvised, that even his commanders called him mad. When the tanks of the Allied invasion got trapped in the mud, when bridges were bombed and rivers turned into death traps, it was Bailey's crazy contraption, built from the bones of a farm tractor, that would carry an army across the impossible. This is the story of how an ordinary engineer built the unthinkable, defied every rule of war, and gave the Allies the bridge they needed to win. Before he was called mad, Donald Bailey was just another civil servant in the British War Office, a man of drafts and blueprints, not battlefields. He worked in silence while the bombs fell over London, sketching in the dim light of blackout lamps. He had spent years designing bridges for rivers no one cared about, wooden spans for small villages, iron trusses for rural railways. But when the war exploded across Europe, those small drawings suddenly mattered more than ever. The British Army was moving faster than its engineers could build, and every bridge the Germans blew up left men stranded, tanks isolated, and offensives broken before they began. The generals called for miracles. What they got was Bailey. In 1940, while France was burning, Bailey sat in a small shed behind the Ministry of Supply, staring at a dismantled farm tractor. It was heavy, reliable, and simple, the kind of machine that could survive mud, rain, and chaos. He began to sketch an idea. What if bridges could be built like machines? What if they could roll forward with the army assembled not by engineers, but by soldiers, even under fire? To his superiors, it sounded absurd. To Bailey, it was the only way to win. They told him it was too dangerous, too experimental. No commander would trust a bridge built from prefabricated panels. But Bailey kept designing some, working at night, scavenging steel from workshops, using parts from old vehicles. He cut and bolted the pieces himself until one evening, in the glow of a flickering lantern, a crude shape began to emerge. It looked less like a bridge and more like an armored monster, a skeleton of girders, gears, and tractor parts. It wasn't pretty, but it could hold a tank. When he showed it to his team, they laughed. One officer called it a farm boy's fantasy. Another said, "You'll kill more men than you save." Bailey said nothing. He only climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key, and watched as the machine rumbled forward, dragging a section of steel across the mud. The bridge unfolded behind it, locking into place like the limbs of a giant creature. In that moment, they stopped laughing. Bailey had done something no one else could. He had made a bridge that could build itself. But when the plans reached command, they were stamped rejected, too impractical for combat. Bailey's heart sank. He had risked his career, defied orders, and poured every ounce of belief into an invention no one wanted. Yet, as the war dragged on and the Allies prepared for the invasion of France, the impossible began to look necessary. The planners of D-Day faced a grim truth. The beaches of Normandy were lined with rivers, hedgerows, and marshes that no army could cross without bridges. Conventional engineering would take days. The soldiers would die waiting. And somewhere in a forgotten storeroom lay a rejected blueprint for a mad machine that could change everything. Bailey was summoned back. His idea, once dismissed as lunacy, was suddenly the Allies' last hope. He worked day and night with a team of soldiers and mechanics, turning scrap into structure, tractor engines into power units, and rivets into salvation. Every bolt mattered. Every weld was a prayer. By the time the first prototype rolled out, the machine had no name, just a whispered promise. It could hold 40 tons of steel and roll through hell. Bailey didn't want glory. He only wanted it to work. And when it did, when tanks roared across his crazy bridge during secret field tests, even the skeptical officers stood in silence. They realized they were witnessing not an invention, but a revolution. The night before D-Day was not a night at all. It was a long, trembling breath before the storm. The English coast was alive with thunder, the low groan of landing craft engines, the rattle of trucks, the smell of diesel and sea salt mixing with the quiet dread of men who knew what awaited them across the channel. Donald Bailey stood far from the beaches, in a field workshop lit by floodlights, surrounded by his creation, rows of strange metallic skeletons stacked like bones, their rivets gleaming in the night. Each one was a bridge in waiting, a piece of steel salvation ready to be driven into chaos. Bailey had built them for this moment, yet as he listened to the distant rumble of aircraft overhead, doubt crept into his mind. Could a bridge made of tractor parts in hope truly survive the fire of war? When dawn broke on June 6, 1944, the world changed in a single tide. The beaches of Normandy erupted under the fury of machine guns and shells. The sea turned black with smoke and red with sacrifice. The first waves of Allied troops landed, clawing their way up the sand under a storm of bullets. But what the generals feared most wasn't the beach. It was what lay beyond it. Behind those dunes stretched the Normandy countryside, a maze of flooded fields, shattered villages, and rivers swollen with spring rain. The tanks could land, the men could march. But without bridges, the invasion would choke in its own momentum. And so in the hours after the beaches were secured, a new battle began. A war not of bullets, but of engineering. Bailey's invention, which the soldiers now called simply the Bailey Bridge, rolled ashore in crates and panels, carried by exhausted men who didn't know its creator's name, only that their lives might depend on it. Each section was light enough to be lifted by hand, designed with bolts that could be hammered in with rifle butts if tools were lost. The brilliance of Bailey's design was its simplicity. No cranes, no machinery, no blueprints required. It was the Lego of war, a modular miracle that could span rivers under fire. Yet building one in the middle of a battlefield was something no one had ever tried. Outside the village of Bayeux, the 50th Northumbrian Division hit their first major obstacle, a collapsed stone bridge over the Soule River. German artillery had reduced it to rubble, and the tanks lined up helplessly on the far bank while snipers picked off engineers who tried to cross. The commander shouted for options, and someone mentioned the Bailey thing. Within minutes, a crew of sappers began unloading the panels, each weighing nearly 600 pounds, while mortar shells fell around them like hammers from the sky. Men shouted through the smoke, the clang of steel echoing through the valley. They built not in days but in hours, driving pins through twisted girders, cursing, bleeding, sweating as the river rose. The bridge began to take shape, a metallic serpent growing across the water. Donald Bailey wasn't there to see it, but reports reached him through the radio, bridge holding under full load. Those words, transmitted through static, were the closest thing to a medal he would ever receive. Tanks roared across his bridge, the earth shaking beneath them, the steel flexing but never breaking. What he had built in solitude now bore the weight of an army. The soldiers called it the Miracle Bridge, though Bailey would later say with quiet humility, it was just good engineering. But even he couldn't deny the miracle unfolding. Over the next days, dozens of Bailey bridges were assembled across Normandy, over rivers, ravines, craters, and canals, pushing the front line forward faster than the Germans believed possible. In one chilling account from the Orne River, the 79th Armored Division attempted to cross under direct enemy fire. Shells screamed overhead, bursting into fountains of mud and flame. But the engineers didn't stop. They worked through the night, their hands blistered and burned, their uniforms soaked with river water and sweat. When dawn rose, the bridge stood, battered, blackened, but alive. Sherman tanks rolled across it, their treads ringing against steel that had been built by men who refused to quit. And behind every clanging rivet, every trembling beam, was Bailey's vision. A bridge that didn't just carry soldiers, but carried faith. The enemy soon learned to fear it. German reconnaissance pilots began reporting instant bridges appearing overnight, structures that seemed to materialize where destruction had reigned the day before. Commanders were baffled. How could the Allies rebuild so fast? They didn't know that each Bailey Bridge could be erected by hand, piece by piece, faster than any German demolition team could destroy it. What began as one man's crazy tractor-powered idea became the backbone of Allied mobility. Every crossing became a race, destruction versus innovation, and Bailey's bridges kept winning. By the summer of 1944, the war had changed its rhythm. The Allies were no longer crawling out of trenches or clawing through beaches. They were moving like a tide, unstoppable, and roaring eastward toward Germany. Yet behind the thunder of artillery and the grind of tank treads, there was a quieter heartbeat, the rhythm of hammers, rivets, and the metallic song of Bailey bridges rising across rivers that once divided empires. What began as a desperate improvisation at Normandy had become a weapon in its own right, a machine of momentum. Wherever the British or American flags advanced, the Bailey Bridge followed, in the hands of soldiers who had learned to trust steel over superstition. The war's speed, its reach, even its very heartbeat now depended on what Bailey had built in that dim, oil-scented workshop years earlier. As the Allies pushed through France, they faced a broken land, roads cratered by bombs, bridges ripped apart by retreating German forces. Rivers turned into barriers of despair. Every mile forward meant another obstacle, another shattered crossing. But Bailey's design was ready for it. Convoys of flatbed trucks carried bridge panels across the continent like arteries carrying blood. When a column was stopped by a collapsed bridge, it no longer meant weeks of delay. Within hours, soldiers unpacked steel frames, drove pins through holes, and slid panels into place. The clang of metal became the sound of progress. Under moonlight, the glow of welding torches marked the birth of new pathways across the rubble of war. The Germans called them Geisterbrücken, ghost bridges, because they appeared faster than they could be destroyed. At the heart of this miracle was not technology, but trust. Bailey's bridge was simple, modular, and brutally efficient, but it demanded something deeper from those who built it: faith that steel and sweat could defeat fear and chaos. In the thick of battle, that faith became a weapon of its own. In one corner of northern France, a Royal Engineer sergeant led his men to erect a bridge across the river Odin under heavy shell fire. They worked in pairs, one holding the beam, the other driving the pin, swapping every few minutes as exhaustion blurred their eyes. By dawn, the bridge stood complete. As the first Sherman tank rolled across, the men who built it collapsed on the riverbank, too tired to cheer, too alive to stop. Later, they would learn that crossing had saved an entire battalion from encirclement. Their bridge had turned a trap into a victory, a small miracle hidden in the machinery of war. Donald Bailey, meanwhile, was back in England, overseeing production. He lived between blueprints and telegrams, his days a blur of noise and numbers. More than 500,000 bridge panels were being produced by factories across Britain, from Birmingham to Glasgow, and shipped to Europe. Yet for all the scale, he remained a solitary figure. Visitors described him as pale, sleepless, and strangely quiet, as if haunted by the ghosts of every soldier who had crossed his bridges. "The men build them," said he once said softly. "I just gave them the means." For Bailey, the triumph was not personal. It was human. His invention belonged to the men who carried it through fire and mud, who turned his sketches into salvation. By September, the Allies reached the great rivers of Belgium and Holland. Here, the test of engineering met the fury of resistance. The Germans had flooded the lowlands, turning fields into swamps and canals into traps. Armies that moved with speed in France now faced water at every turn. But the Bailey Bridge evolved again. Engineers built them longer, higher, sometimes stacking multiple layers for extra strength. The most daring of these feats came during Operation Market Garden, when Allied forces tried to leap into the heart of the Netherlands. Bailey bridges were pushed to their limits, spanning 200-foot gaps under relentless artillery fire. One officer described it as building a lifeline with death standing on your shoulder. When the bridges held, they didn't just save lives. They saved the hope that the war could end before another winter. Everywhere they went, soldiers added their own marks to Bailey's creation. Names were painted on beams: Victory, Home Stretch, Margaret, Unbreakable. Some were dedicated to fallen comrades. Others carried quiet prayers. The bridge became a living symbol of the men who built it, a monument to courage assembled not in stone, but in motion. And as each crossing succeeded, as each army advanced, the legend of the mad engineer grew. Few soldiers knew his face, But all knew his name. In muddy mess tents and along shattered roadsides, they whispered it like a charm. Bailey's Bridge will hold. The war had many heroes. Pilots who ruled the skies, tank commanders who broke enemy lines, spies who vanished into shadows. But Bailey's heroism was of a quieter kind. When the war finally ended, the guns fell silent. But the world that emerged from the smoke was one built on ruins. Cities were craters, bridges lay in rivers like broken ribs, and roads disappeared beneath ash and twisted metal. The same armies that had conquered Europe now faced the task of stitching it back together. Yet as bulldozers rumbled and nations began to rebuild, one structure, one humble, modular design, became the symbol of reconstruction. The Bailey Bridge, the so-called mad invention that had carried tanks into battle, now carried hope across the scars of war. In peace as in war, Bailey's creation proved unstoppable. Its steel bones rose again, this time not under fire, but under the weight of renewal. Donald Bailey himself returned to civilian life quietly, his war over, but his work far from done. He was promoted within the Ministry of Supply, but no parades greeted him, no cheering crowds. His reward was the sight of trucks and tractors rolling once more over the bridges he had designed, the same machines that had inspired his first experiment years before. Britain was battered, hungry, and cold. Bridges weren't luxuries, they were lifelines. When floods tore through villages or when roads collapsed from years of neglect, soldiers and civilians alike turned to the Bailey Bridge. It became the skeleton key of reconstruction, opening roads that had been closed by war and reconnecting people to each other. Its panels, stamped with the simple mark B for Bailey, became as common as bricks, appearing in every corner of Europe, and then, astonishingly, across the world. From the Alps to the Andes, from India to Africa, Bailey bridges began appearing wherever disaster struck. They crossed rivers in Burma and valleys in Kenya. They replaced wooden crossings in Canada and linked islands in New Zealand. What had been born out of necessity became a global tool of survival. British engineers called it the bridge that conquered peace. It was fast, flexible, and nearly indestructible, perfect for rebuilding in lands torn by war, floods, or earthquakes. And while other wartime inventions, radar, jets, rockets, belonged to governments and scientists, the Bailey Bridge belonged to the people. It could be built by anyone with courage, strength, and a hammer. For Bailey, this was both humbling and haunting. He had built a design that outlived its purpose, a machine that refused to die. In interviews, he spoke softly about his work, his words careful and sparse. "It was never meant to last," he once said, "but I am glad it did." Yet behind that modest tone was a man changed by the weight of his own creation. He had seen his bridge save lives, and he had seen it cost them. He carried that duality quietly, like a soldier carries an old wound, unseen, but never forgotten. Those who knew him described him as kind but distant, always sketching, always thinking, as if still haunted by the ghosts of Normandy. In 1946, King George VI knighted him for his service to engineering and the nation. The ceremony was short, almost austere. Bailey bowed, the medal pinned to his chest, but even then he seemed uneasy with praise. "I just built a bridge," he told a journalist afterward. The brave men were the ones who crossed it. It was perhaps the truest thing he ever said. His invention had carried heroes, but he remained one in silence. That humility made him something rare, a man whose greatness was measured not by recognition, but by what he gave to others. As the decades passed, the Bailey Bridge continued to serve. During the Korean War, it spanned valleys and rivers under bombardment once again. In the aftermath of floods in Bangladesh, its panels held together rescue routes. In earthquake zones across Asia, it became the first structure to rise amid devastation. Soldiers, engineers, and civilians used the same simple method Bailey had invented with his tractor prototype: bolt, lift, connect, repeat. No blueprints were needed. The knowledge had passed into instinct, into the hands of generations who had never heard his name but lived by his design. Even as technology advanced, as helicopters replaced trucks and carbon composites replaced steel, the Bailey Bridge remained, timeless, unyielding, stubbornly relevant. In post-war Europe, many towns built permanent bridges on Bailey frames, unable to afford new construction. Some of those bridges still stand today, rusted but strong, their rivets holding stories that no one remembers, but that the steel refuses to forget. In Normandy, along the Soul's River, where one of the first Bailey bridges was erected under fire, the locals still call it the Miracle Bridge. Farmers cross it daily, unaware that beneath their tires lies a relic of courage and invention. It is perhaps the most fitting tribute to Bailey's legacy, his work blending so completely into the fabric of life that it no longer feels like invention at all, but nature itself. Long after the echoes of gunfire had faded, after the flags had been folded and the soldiers had gone home, the story of Donald Bailey remained suspended, like one of his bridges, between two worlds. On one side, the chaos of war, on the other, the quiet persistence of peace. His was not the kind of legacy carved into marble or recorded in grand speeches. It was quieter, humbler, built not in a single moment of glory, but in thousands of hours of belief. The mad engineer had done something extraordinary, not merely because he invented a bridge that won battles, but because he proved that imagination could be a weapon as powerful as any gun. His bridge had not just connected two sides of a river, it had connected what humanity could destroy with what it could rebuild. To understand Bailey's story is to understand the invisible thread that runs through every act of courage in history, the moment when an ordinary person refuses to accept that something cannot be done. That thread runs through the muddy fields of Normandy, where men assembled his bridges under fire, and through the small workshop in England, where a man hunched over blueprints while the world burned around him. Bailey's courage was not forged in combat, but in conviction. He did not charge into battle. He challenged the boundaries of what was possible. Every bolt he tightened, every beam he measured, carried the weight of millions he would never meet. And yet, he believed in metal, in mathematics, in men. That belief became the foundation upon which the war for freedom advanced. The power of Bailey's story lies in its paradox. He built a tool of war that became a monument to peace. His bridges were meant to carry tanks, yet they came to carry food, medicine, and rebuilding crews. He created something meant for destruction, and it ended up saving lives long after the guns went silent. That transformation, from instrument of survival to symbol of renewal, mirrors the transformation of humanity itself after the Second World War. Nations that once sought to destroy each other now used Bailey's invention to rebuild each other's cities. Steel that had groaned beneath the weight of tanks now bore the laughter of children on bicycles, the hum of cars, the footsteps of workers crossing rivers once choked with debris. Bailey's bridge did not just outlast the war, it outgrew it. There is something deeply human in that evolution. In every age, in every conflict, there are people like Donald Bailey, uncelebrated minds who see possibility in the ruins, who imagine bridges where others see barriers. They are the quiet architects of history, their work hidden beneath the roar of headlines. Yet without them, the world collapses. Bailey's invention was never about brilliance alone. It was about empathy, the instinct to build rather than to destroy, to connect rather than to divide. He never sought recognition because he knew that invention, at its purest, is an act of service. To create something that helps others endure, that to him was enough. And yet, behind his calm exterior, Bailey carried the same burden that every great innovator does: doubt. There were nights when he feared his bridge would fail, when the steel would buckle under the weight of tanks, when lives would be lost because of a calculation he had made in exhaustion. But courage is not the absence of fear. It is the act of building anyway. Bailey built knowing failure could mean death, and that is a kind of bravery few metals can honor. His courage wasn't loud or visible. It was the quiet, stubborn kind, the courage of endurance, of faith in one's hands, one's craft, one's purpose. In the decades that followed, engineers studied the Bailey Bridge not just for its mechanics, but for its philosophy. It was the embodiment of wartime ingenuity, modular, adaptable, democratic. Anyone could build it, anywhere, with almost nothing. It didn't rely on genius or privilege. It relied on teamwork, on discipline, on the courage to start building even under the worst circumstances. And maybe that's why it endures. Not because it was perfect, but because it was human. It was designed with the understanding that chaos cannot be predicted, that simplicity often saves more lives than sophistication, and that progress begins when someone dares to begin. In a world still divided by new conflicts and invisible lines, Bailey's Bridge remains a metaphor for what humanity most desperately needs. Every generation faces its own rivers, of fear, of hatred, of indifference, and every generation must decide whether to build or to burn. Bailey's story reminds us that even the smallest act of creation is a rebellion against despair. To build a bridge, in any form, is to declare that connection matters more than destruction. It is to believe that human hands, guided by imagination, can shape the world towards something better. That belief is the essence of civilization itself. Time, like war, moves on, but it never truly leaves what it has touched. Decades after the last shots of World War II were fired, long after Donald Bailey's name faded from headlines and textbooks, his bridges continued to stretch across rivers and valleys, quietly carrying the world forward. They no longer bore tanks and artillery. Now they carried children to school, farmers to markets, and ambulances across floodwaters. Their steel had rusted, their bolts worn smooth by wind and rain, yet they held, defying decay as they once defied destruction. And in that endurance lies the final chapter of Bailey's legacy. Not victory, not invention, but permanence. The proof that what is built with purpose can outlast the age that created it. By the late 20th century, many of Bailey's wartime bridges were still in use, some having survived longer than the very men who built them. In small towns across Britain, Canada, India, and Africa, locals could drive across a Bailey Bridge without knowing its name or its origin. Some were patched with modern materials, others reinforced, but many remained unchanged, a testament to the brilliance of their design. The same locking pins, the same prefabricated trusses, the same rhythmic assembly that once echoed across Normandy were still serving civilians decades later. A bridge assembled in one night under German fire could last half a century under the slow erosion of time. That resilience wasn't an accident. It was Bailey's philosophy forged in steel. Make it simple, make it strong, make it human. In remote corners of the world, Bailey's creation became more than just infrastructure. It became memory. In Burma and Nepal, engineers still call it the soldier's bridge. In Africa, villagers say the British bridge never dies. In post-war Japan, one stood so long that it became a landmark, a quiet reminder of how the tools of war can become instruments of life. Each span carries invisible ghosts of the men who built it under fire, of the hands that bolted it together, of the voice that first dared to imagine it in a dark workshop lit by fear and determination. These bridges, now part of the landscape, are as close as humanity gets to eternal motion, living monuments that connect generations not through memory, but through use. And yet history has a cruel way of forgetting its quiet saviors. As the world entered the age of computers and rockets, the story of the man behind the bridge, the mad engineer who changed the course of the war with a tractor and an idea, vanished from public consciousness. There were no statues built for Donald Bailey, no great films about his life. But in the quiet corners of military museums, among dust-covered blueprints and oil-stained photos, his legacy still whispers. Curators tell young visitors that the bridge they see on display once carried an entire army across Europe. Some listen, some move on, but a few stay, staring at the steel panels, trying to imagine how a single human mind conceives something so enduring in a moment of such chaos. For those few, Bailey's genius becomes real again, not as myth, but as proof of what one person can do when they refuse to surrender to the impossible. In 2019, a small Bailey Bridge in southern England was officially declared a historical monument. Locals petitioned for its preservation, saying it represented the courage of common men who built under fire. Engineers restored it rather than replace it, even though newer materials could have done the job faster. When asked why, one of them said simply, "You don't destroy something that held so much." That sentiment, That reverence is the quiet echo of Bailey's influence. It's a recognition that progress is not always about replacing the old with the new, but about understanding the purpose behind what was made. Bailey's Bridge was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to endure, and in doing so, it became immortal. There's a haunting beauty in how his invention aged. While monuments of generals crumble and their names fade from memory, Bailey's bridges still carry the weight of everyday life. They are not admired from afar, they are lived upon. Cars rumble over them, pedestrians cross them, raindrops drum on their beams. They are touched by the world every day, and in that contact, the past becomes present. In every vibration of steel, there's an echo of war, of fear, of hope. The bridge does not just remember, it feels. And though steel cannot speak, if it could, it would say, "We held." We still hold. Donald Bailey's story reminds us that some legacies do not need fame to survive. They live in the quiet continuance of what they created. His bridges are not artifacts of the past. They are functioning acts of faith, proof that courage and creativity can transcend their original moment.